Good afternoon. Welcome to our panel on cyber norms. I'm Michael Nowakowski. I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panel and then we'll begin. The way this will work is each panelist will have about 20 minutes to talk about their topic. I invite you at the end of their presentation, if you do have any questions, to please ask those questions, and we'll get started here just momentarily. So today with us we have Jenny Greiman. She's going to be talking to us about how we define aggressors and how we analyze policies, laws, and regulations regarding cyber. We next have Shar Sample, who will be talking about thoughts on attribution. Several of the speakers this morning talked about how difficult attribution is, and Char's going to maybe bring a non-technical view on that, realizing that folks are different around the world. They don't all act the same. They don't all think the way we think. Next we have Chris Spiritu talking about an example of norms for industrial control system or critical infrastructure, specifically looking at nuclear power plants. So how do we better protect our critical infrastructure? And then last we have Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Wong, who will be talking about disruptive innovations and how those innovations will help us gain an edge in kind of this asymmetric battlefield called cyberspace. With that, Jenny Greiman talked about the first topic.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is my second NATO conference from the Center of Excellence, and I will be back to all of them. It's very exciting to be here at this first US conference, and I was excited when I learned about it. So I want to thank the Army Cyber Institute as well for sponsoring this, as well as IEEE, who I've worked with in the past, and it is really a pleasure to be here. Now, I only have 20 minutes, so as a professor, I've learned how to talk pretty fast and cover a very broad topic in a very short period of time. And I will allow about 5 minutes for questions at the end, but of course that's an ongoing offer. You will have my email, and I would welcome your input. I'm always looking for opportunities to collaborate with research, so I'm open to any and all ideas as to how we might continue to work together. This is just the beginning. So my topic, cyber attacks, the fog of identity. As I travel around the world, I spent many years in government as well with the US Department of Justice and the Department of State, and I worked in Eastern Europe and Central Europe after the fall of communism, and I began to recognize the complexities of understanding each other's laws, legal systems, and how they're applied and how they're interpreted so differently. And the fog of identity is referring not just to the fact that we have difficulty identifying the attacker, but we also have difficulty processing an event. And I say that coming from Boston. You may remember back in 2013, a bomb that cost $600 made by 2 Chetnian students killed 4 people, including a police officer and one of my students from China at Boston University, and ruined the lives of 300 other people, many of whom lost their life or their limbs. And processing that attack reminds me that we all need to think about the possibility of events all the time. That attack, as I mentioned, cost the attackers $600, and they did well over $2 billion worth of damage. And we've been warned about the fact that cyber attacks can do very, very serious damage. Now, the cyber component of the attack on the Boston Marathon was the cell phone, the use of cell phones to communicate the time to the bomb, which was placed in a receptacle. Now, identification, the fog of identity. The identity of the perpetrators occurred because one of our department stores, Lord and Taylor, happened to have a camera within the vicinity. That helped tremendously, as you can imagine, in bringing forth to the courts evidence. The outcome of that, besides the dreadful serious loss of life, is that the one perpetrator that survived will receive capital punishment, life in prison. And we haven't had capital punishment in Massachusetts since about, I think, 1949. So looking at these events and how we respond to them is very important. I do an awful lot of research around cyber in different areas, and one of the things I've been trying to understand for the past couple of years is how do we delineate the threshold between cyber war, cyber crime, cyber terrorism, and cyber espionage. And how do we, trying to defend our own systems, how do we respond, but more important, looking at these responses to date and trying to make some sense out of them. I also, of course, as a lawyer, look at what laws we have that can provide guidance, including Article 51 of the United Nations Charter and our NATO treaty, including Articles 4 and 5, and of course, our NATO guidelines on cyber warfare. And understanding the problems of applying these laws, which were developed years ago for a traditional kinetic war zone. And then finally, to take a look at the role of the effects test, which is a legal term, in separating a cyber attack from cyber warfare. So I don't know how well you can see this slide, but it is in my paper. And what I am trying to show here is the different types of cyber events that the entity may have to respond to, whether it be a government or a private entity or an individual. On the left, cyber warfare, in the red, represents the incidents that may occur that could be classified as either use of force or an armed attack. And just understanding the difference between the use of force, which doesn't justify a war, and an armed attack would take us about 3 days at least just to begin the discussion. But I reference it now so that we understand the complexity from a legal perspective of that regime. And then underneath the red circle, the green circle represents a cyber attack that falls below the threshold of cyber war. And NATO has certainly done an admirable job of trying to separate attacks that do not fall under cyber warfare. Now, one that's become very popular, an attack, in the yellow circle, and I highlighted it in yellow, is what we call cyber espionage. Now, you hear a lot about cyber espionage, and do we really understand what it is? Who governs cyber espionage? Certainly in my research, I've looked at we've got 193 countries, a member of the United Nations. If I looked at every country's rules on cyber espionage, none of them would look exactly alike. In fact, some countries, through their strategic cyber strategies, have told us that they consider espionage an armed attack. Now, we don't in the United States, and certainly NATO does not consider espionage to be an armed attack. but how we're using it in the legal sense is very important. And then the blue circle. And this is what I call the default position for most attacks, and that is cybercrime. And when we have not, due to the fog of identity, identified the type of attack, we often call it a cybercrime. But the problem with cybercrimes are, nothing is crime unless it says so by law. And crimes are established nationally. So our cybercrimes in the US look even very different than our similar language-speaking countries in the UK. So consequently, when we're talking about cybercrime, whose law are we talking about? And granted, we have a treaty on cybercrime, but our treaty was developed primarily for mutual assistance. And even though it compels the member countries of our European Council on Cybercrime to try to harmonize the law, just as it's been difficult for NATO to define the norms, it's very difficult even under a treaty to come to consensus, which we call in the law, we often call treaties the soft law. So now I'm going to move on to the meaning of attack under international law. And there we look at an armed attack under jus ad bellum. That's when a state may resort to the use of force under the law, under Article 51 of the UN Charter, but also under what we call international customary law. And unlike most law, international customary law is not written down where we can look it up. We have to look at interpretations of judicial systems over many years. And then we have jus ad bello, which is the conduct of conflict, the rules of engagement once you are already in the conflict. Now, the UN Charter does provide us some guidance. Article 2.4 tells countries we must refrain from the threat or use of force. They use the term use of force. But there are two exceptions. One of the exceptions is Article 39, where the Security Council may authorize collective action to maintain the peace. And Article 51 gives us the right to exercise self-defense if an armed attack occurs. We also have a doctrine called the Caroline Doctrine, which dates back to the 1800s when the British intruded into the US territory to attack Canadian rebels. In international law, this is a standard that may apply when there is an imminent attack and self-defense is required. It's so overwhelming that there is no moment for deliberation. And then, of course, more recently, the Security Council Resolution 1368 affirms the right to self-defense in response to terrorist attacks. NATO Article 4 is very important because it allows for collective consultation among the nations who have determined, can come together and determine a response to a cyber attack. So this ability to consult is very important. But there is a split in terms of interpretation of Article 4. Is it mandatory? Must all member nations of NATO consult? Are there any exceptions to NATO Article 4? How often do we use it? Has it been effective? And how do we measure our success in coming together and consulting when there is a cyber attack? NATO Article 5, which provides for collective defense and assistance. NATO Article 5 stands for an attack against one nation is an attack against all. A cyber attack will not constitute an armed attack that obligates member states to assist one another under Article 5 of the treaty. Now, I am quoting from scholarly research. There are some scholars who believe that Article 5 does not mandate assistance. There are others who believe it is a mandatory provision. And what I'm pointing out to you today is there are differences in interpretation. If Article 4 mandates consultation, and again we raise the question with who is obligated to consult? Does Article 5 mandate assistance? There's a lot of scholarship out there which basically claims you may not have to assist, and that is a very striking and important concern. So we all have to process an attack at one time or another. And when we're processing an attack, very difficult to determine instantaneously, and forget attribution, that's a separate question. But what is the purpose of the attack? Is it cyber war? Is it a crime? Is it espionage? Is it terrorism? Can I attribute the attack? What is the proper response? And how can risk be reduced? We also have to answer the question of what is cyber warfare? Is it a state-sponsored use of weapons? Is it operating within the cyberspace domain? Because we also have different definitions of cyberspace. I was reassured at the Tallinn conference among several of the world's experts that control systems are included in the definition of cyberspace. But they concern me greatly because they're not necessarily connected to the network as we define, under some countries' laws, cyberspace. And then what has to happen in order to classify the attack legally? Does it have to cause real-world destructive effects? What must the scope be? The death of 20 civilians? 1 civilian? Can cyber warfare be just attack on property, as we see so many economic crimes today? What are the destructive effects? And I'm happy to see that Professor Schmidt is here at the conference today because he has developed a consequence-based approach which deals with scope, severity, immediateness, directness, measurability, presumptive legitimacy. Can you imagine processing all of this in 15 or 30 seconds, or even 2 minutes or 5 minutes? It brings challenges to the Air Force's concept of the OODA loop. How do we observe and orient ourselves, make a decision, and act when a cyber attack occurs? So I've got about 5 minutes. I'm trying to keep on time. I'm going to pose a question. Can you all see this? Can you see it in the back? Yes, no? Yes, very good. So my question is, I've listed several events because I spent a lot of time studying events and how we respond to them. And the question is, are these armed attacks? The Estonia distributed denial of service attacks in 2007, the Bangladesh bank hacking attack, which just occurred last year, 2015, $82 million gone in a matter of seconds. The Office of Personnel Management, I was one of those employees who has been hacked in 2015. the Sony attacks, which you've heard a lot about so far this morning in 2014, the Stuxnet attacks in 2010, and the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. Were any of those armed attacks? Anybody want to respond?
Yes.
Yes, good.
September 11th armed attack.
Okay, September 11th armed attack.
OPM was espionage.
OPM was espionage. So I only hear one cyber warfare.
Stuxnet.
Armed attack.
Armed attack.
Stuxnet. Okay, the real question is, how do we respond to each of these? Because most of them, if we technically look into them, and if we look at the definition of an armed attack, a couple of them might fit into it. But it doesn't matter so much what it was how did we respond to it at the time. This morning you heard a lot about transparency and openness. And I can tell you there's a lot of confusion out there about how and why we responded to each of these attacks. Most of them, whether for national security reasons, diplomatic reasons, most of them, the international community collectively responded and agreed that these should be treated as economic crimes. We didn't want to touch that. As cyber crimes, as the OPM was treated as an aggressive act of espionage. So we have two standards now. We have espionage, and then we have an aggressive act of espionage. If we look at the damage, does the damage matter? So you mentioned the World Trade Center. Yes, after the attack, we responded to that attack, and the international community treated it as a threat to international peace and security. So now we know in the future, something as severe as the World Trade Center, in the future, would be treated most likely in accordance with the international community collective process as a threat to our international peace and security. Much has been talked about in terms of the Sony attacks just this morning. And I was very troubled by this because at the time, one of the general counsels at Sony contacted me and asked me, what can we do? And it made me realize we don't have good answers. And because we don't have good answers, we often default when we shouldn't. So I'm going to move on very quickly and finish up in 1 minute. Cyber espionage, defined very different under different nations' laws, under our own executive orders, and of course, we do agree in the US with NATO that cyber espionage and other forms of information gathering directed at an adversary during an armed conflict does not violate the law of armed conflict. So I'm going to conclude. What have we learned? There's no common understanding among nations of an armed attack or use of force. Cyber attacks, cyber warfare, cyber crime, cyber espionage have different and conflicting meanings under national security strategies, military codes, and legal frameworks. What do we need? First, before we can even establish norms, we need a shared conceptual and ontological understanding of cyberspace, cyber attacks, cyber weapons, cyber warfare, and state sponsorship. Thank you very much. I welcome any additional questions unless I'm over time.
Maybe just one quick question if there is one. Questions? In the back, if you can say it loudly.
Yeah, I can talk loud enough. I'm just curious to know why the Stuxnet virus was categorized as a economic crime.
If you can repeat the question for the
Okay, the question is, why was the Stuxnet virus treated outside of the cyber warfare? Well, we have to rely a lot on the reporting of governments and the information we receive that is not always reliable. But there was concern with Stuxnet that if the true source of the attack was disclosed, it would create great concern in terms of the handling of future attacks going forward. So we defaulted, and we did not move forward and identify the attackers. Stuxnet was considered a retaliation, as you know, and consequently, governments collectively were not prepared to move forward and get out of the realm of our default positions. Usually economic attacks are considered cybercrime. And that goes to the question of how do we define our norms, and will we continue to look at economic crime or look at economic attacks as a crime rather than an act of war. I'd also like to point out, for Sony we used sanctions, and sanctions were used against North Korea based on international law, but not the law of armed conflict, but the international law on wrongful acts based on state responsibility. So there, we did certainly respond, but we responded through international law, and we did not look to the law of armed conflict. Thank you for your question.
Everybody can hear me okay, I hope? So, Shar Sample, and I'm going to talk to you about a different approach to threat intelligence attribution and examining various actors in the cyber realm. We go briefly through a study that I've performed along with my colleagues, Jennifer Cowley, sitting over here in the audience, and Professor Tim Watson at the University of Warwick in the UK, and Professor Carsten Maple, also in the UK. So one of the things that's there's been some assumptions about how hackers actually act, and there's a notion that there's this universal hacker culture that actually dictates how they'll go ahead about doing their attacks. And I thought, this seems a little strange because I seem to recall when I was studying a little bit about educational psychology, when I thought I might want to change careers, that culture was important on how people think. So it got me digging into some other areas, and it turns out that people actually do think differently. And I'll get into that in a second because it's really important that we understand how these different thought patterns occur. Because when we have the different thought patterns, even though we may get to the same destination of a hack or a breach or whatever, we may get there through a different path. And when we get there through a different path, that implies that we're going to leave digital artifacts along the way. And that is really what this research is centered on. So I wanted to see first if there is if we can say, one, does a single hacker culture exist? Two, can we infer a statistical relationship between national cultures and online behaviors and preferences? So this requires a paradigm shift. We need a new framework for how we're evaluating all of this. Typically when we've looked at culture historically, we've looked at it and said, well, we'll bin PTPs together and say, well, we know this about China, we know this about Iran, we know this about Russia, we know this about Syria, and we go right through this list here. But we don't have a unifying framework to put that all together. But fortunately, when you're doing cross-discipline research, if you're fusing your disciplines, you can find such things. And I'm certainly not one to reinvent the wheel. So, culture, what is it? Well, according to Hofstede and Minkoff, culture is software of the mind. Now, as a recovering software programmer from many, many years ago, that resonates with me. Software, yes, somebody's coded it up and it goes and it works, or it fails spectacularly sometimes. But said, okay, so we got this automatic thought processing being invoked. And oftentimes, too, when we're doing our learning, we do involve our automatic thought processing. Little tidbit for everyone here, just little factoids that I found out during the research. When I'm talking to you right now, nervous as I am, and you're listening, you're processing what I'm saying at the rate of 40 to 60 bits per second. When you're seeing all the other things that I'm doing, and thank God you can't see behind the podium where I'm shaking tremendously here, you would notice that all the things that you're registering about me are occurring at a rate of 11 million bits per second. So when we talk about making decisions, we are clearly invoking some of our biases or our unconscious thought process. Nisbet did an excellent book if anybody wants to read it. It's called The Geography of Thought. And one of the things that came out of that book was he said people literally, and he does mean literally in the correct sense of the word, literally see the world differently based on where they're from. Culture influences, as Gus and Dorner have noted in some of their studies, that it influences not just the perception of when you're dealing with a problem, but how you come up with your solutions and which solution you actually choose. And when you put all this together, you find that, yes, people from the East see the world differently. And when you put it in Hofstede's framework, you find that there are numerical values that you can associate with it, which now makes it possible to do quantitative research on human behavior with some level of accuracy. Minkoff, who works with Hofstede, he came up with the sixth cultural dimension, discovered that students from restrained societies are better at math and science than their indulgent counterparts. Even though we may say things like, we hear that a student from an indulgent society may wish to be the best in a specific subject, like math, it may turn out that they actually enjoy the accolades that go along with being the best at the subject. But in terms of the deep knowledge, it comes back to this people in the restrained countries. And when we're talking about these restrained countries, we're talking about countries like Russia and China. China less so than Russia. I forget what the other ones are. There's some of the former Eastern Bloc countries. So we talk about this East-West divide. And so the other interesting thing was this algebra geometry thing. So Nisbet in his studies discovered that students from Eastern countries have, they see the world not just literally differently, they actually see the world in terms of functions. And the Westerners see it in terms of objects. So one of the byproducts of that are the Eastern students tend to be better at arithmetic and algebra, and the Western students tend to be better at geometry. So think about this, object-oriented design versus functional design. Okay? Western students tend to be more prone to the fundamental attribution error. We believe when something goes wrong, there is a cause, and usually a person behind the cause that can be held accountable for that. Easterners might just be the circumstances. And of course, we have the question of management versus control. Think about things like we say in terms of what our warfare objectives are. Do we want to control something or do we want to manage it? A holistic culture prefers to manage over control. So when we talk about things like the cyber kill chain, are we really talking about what our adversaries are doing, or are we putting what they're doing in our terms and advertising to the world how we wish to take over their sites or their environments? All questions that we have to ask ourselves. So my question in all of this is, what does this mean in terms of cyber? So, more background. There's a study, it's called, in slang we call it the WEIRD study. It's actually a longer term, but it was by Heinrich Heine and Noren Zayan back in 2010. WEIRD standing for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic Societies. So apparently there's, now I have a psychologist here in the audience that can validate this, but I have read in that study, I believe, that 90% of the studies that have been done on human behavior have been done on Westerners. Okay, of that 90%, 80% of the participants are US students. So, yeah, this is going to make it very difficult to try to extrapolate this to to Eastern students, or what do we do about countries where people come there, they bridge that divide between East and West. We need to consider the role of national culture in all of this, because there's what we're doing when we're creating our red team and blue team battles and whatnot is we're teaching ourselves how to defend against ourselves, and then we're surprised when the adversary finds a new way in. So, because we're a little tight here on time, I'm going to try to get us back to the back on track here. I'm going to skip through this really quickly. So we understand a bit about defending and attacking against ourselves. But one of the other things that plagues us, and you heard about it this morning, is this notion that we don't have great certainty when we do attribution. Part of the reason we don't have great certainty is the lack of ground truth data. So I actually managed to, in my studies, when I was doing my research, came across some data that was actually pretty interesting. At first, it seemed very boring, because for cyber people, they say, it's just defacement data. But the Zone H data, if you're willing to do a little bit of work, legwork on the attribution, and okay, so yeah, wore out my thumb joints, but it was fun. You can actually find some interesting things in this data. It's just defacement data, but it has attack vectors and why they did it, and all the things like the actual defacement data that's been mirrored on a site, so you can see what their messaging is, and you can see who all they're friends with, and lots of interesting things. And when you're looking at an archive of over 11 million records, over 10 million years, you can start doing things like doing statistical analysis on some of that data, because you can pull it onto the framework. So what I did for this particular study is I said, look, we started with this notion of this single hacker culture. I said, what was the busiest year that I had in this data? Because we had a tight timeline on this. And I said, 2011 looked to be a very, very busy year. And I started with all my ones that I had attributed from another study through, because they were political, patriotic attackers who already have a desire to have their identities known. And I didn't have to know who the exact actor was, I just needed to know what country they were from. So, 215,000 records for the year 2011. Turns out there were about 20 countries that we could group them across. And we had our 6 dimensions of culture, which I will get to them in a minute here. And because culture is scored on a scale of 0 to 100 for each of the dimensions, it's easy to divvy it up. You say, if they're low on it, these are the attributes you associated. So that's 1/3 low, 1/3 high with the other end of the attributes, and 1/3 kind of falls out there in the middle. For this study, I calculated the median values for each of the dimensions, and then calculated the dimensions for each of the preferences, ran it through, and saw what wanted to come out. So let's talk a little bit about this Zone H data, because this is ground truth data that we had to start with. And this is an example of one of the records. So it looks pretty boring when you look at it this way. It's got the date that the attack occurred. The date that the attack was validated was not, it was kind of blown away there. This YMH is the hacker group. YMH, yeah. So actually that group is out of Yemen. And this other one here, this is the domain. So a bunch of hackers from Yemen took care of a Saudi Arabian domain. It gives the actual IP address of that domain. Tells you what operating system was running, good old Linux, running Apache. And they did it for political reasons, and they chose a brute force attack. And then this /deface, that's actually the mirror site that has the defacement data on it. And whether it was a regular or a mass defacement, if it was a redefacement or not, if it's published, primary, homepage or secondary. And then this unique number down here, that's how Zone H keeps track of them, uniquely identifies them. And what's interesting here is this United States tells you that that server was housed in the United States. So Saudi Arabia site, and there was actually using a US cloud service provider. Now, to various people I said this data is interesting. To a cyber person, they're going to focus on things like vectors, addresses, and platforms. To a behavioral scientist, they're obviously going to be interested in things like reasons, linguistics, messaging, and the defacements. And the data scientists, they're just thrilled at the fact that they've got volume, so a volume of data that they can go do things like see what patterns are emerging, coming up with timelines. So it's a fun set of data to play with. A different one that was attributed to Novato here. So once we do attribution on a record, and I did say it's a painful process because it involves going manually to the defaced site for the first set of clues. And then you have to find out if you found what you were looking for on there, can I validate it from other sources like social media or perhaps a conviction? So In this particular case, we have a Brazilian site that was hacked by Tunavato, and it took a bit of effort to find Tunavato, but it turns out he's from Paraguay, or he or she or the group is from Paraguay. So now we can say, now I can assign that record of value Paraguay. So MITRE comes out, and SANS comes up with a list every year of what are the top attack vectors. Okay, so the top attack vectors for 2011 were SQL injection, operating system command, buffer overflow, still around, believe it or not, cross-site scripting, and missing authentication. So this, in the middle is the list there, and on the left is the first attack vector that I had for all my attackers for that year for the different countries. Now, so it looks okay. It looks like what we're seeing is kind of normal-ish. Except what's interesting, I had a friend one time who worked with me at CERT, Rhiannon Weaver. She's a marvelous statistician, and one of the things she told me when I first got into doing some of this research was that all the interesting data is in the outliers. And she was right. So, who's doing password stealing? Who's doing file inclusion for their first choice? Who burns an O-day on a website defacement, right? So those were the interesting things, and we'll get to those in a second. And then on the second choice, you would expect to see one of these 6. So you expect maybe SQL injection first, maybe like, I don't know, operating system command or cross-site scripting, one of these to show up in the second one, and we don't see it at all for the second choice. So that was very interesting to us, because now we're getting into they don't really care how they're getting it done, but they have certain things are resonating. And when we actually looked at the numbers, because we're short on time, I usually query the audience and say, who do you think was the busiest attacker? And nobody gets the country right, so I'm going to give you a gift on this one. It was Turkey. Turkey has a phenomenal amount of attacks, and they had clear delineations between their first preference, their second preference, and their third preference. Their first preference, there were like 87,000 of the attacks were password sniffing. And the second one, I believe, second preference, I think was something like file inclusion. So they were clearly not following the playbook here. So, what did we see here? So we found out that with the known vulnerabilities, the countries that were using going by the playbook, they tended to be kind of in the middle on restraint, but nothing really remarkable about them. SQL injectors tended to also be kind of in the middle there on short-term and long-term orientation, which right here. And I should say, the numbers you're seeing on the right are the median values for the Hofstede overall dimension. The number on the left of the slash is the median value for the attackers. But then look down here, this configuration admin error. I think it was Albania was one of them, and I forget who the other one was, but very high in power distance. So these are very authoritarian countries. Their average, their value there is 85. And of course, when we look at, they're also tended to be a bit short-term oriented and, again, a bit restrained. Now, when I looked at the things like the file inclusion and the 0 days, this is where things got really interesting. It turned out that my file inclusions, they associated with short-term orientation. No big surprise there. 0 days, very, very short-term orientation. So who burns 0 days? Somebody who apparently has very little patience or a very short timeline and does not want to delay gratification. URL poisoning, favored by very authoritarian, cautious, long-term oriented countries. These are what these numbers are telling us, and they're restrained also. So who's what? Power distance. Who's high power distance? Red countries tend to be higher in power distance. The lighter countries tend to be more egalitarian in nature. And this behavior of configuration admin and URL poisonings tended to associate with those dimensions. With that dimension. Long-term versus short-term orientation, again, configuration admin, attackers that use those vectors, SQL injection, file inclusion, or 0 days in our URL poisoning. Indulgent versus restraint, again, configuration mistakes, known vulnerabilities, URL poisoning. So we're starting to see a little bit of a difference shake out here. This is only 1 year's worth. Remembering that I typically like to do, 10 years so we can trend the data and do things like that because of the way the attack behaviors kind of fluctuate throughout. Some things that were interesting that came out of this study, though, was that, this notion that not everybody is leading with what you would expect. Countries that were rather experienced and you would think would know better, would know to play by the certain playbook, didn't. They had their own way of doing things. So there's a lot of other studies that we're kicking off right now in this area, and we're certainly anxious to collaborate with other people on this because there is a lot of work. There's still a lot more attribution that needs to be done. And we're also in the process of purchasing newer, fresher archive of that data that'll take us up to 2016, so we even have more records to play with because, well, we just love data. That's my contact info. I think I got us just about back on time here, but I think we have time for a question, right? Or just two.
Any questions from the audience?
Yes?
Back?
When you're looking at sort of the differences among cultures, do you think that there's anything in there that says they may not necessarily have a super deep bench of hackers, and these are the more personal preferences of their best hackers?
So, yeah. So the question was, when we're looking at the cultures, are we looking? They may not have a deep bench, so these are the individual hackers' preferences, right? So what I've done so far is I grouped them all together, and I can tell you that some of the countries that we've looked at, like Turkey, they have a rather deep bench. They have by far and away the most groups that we've identified, even on just the selfies, and that's not the, we have two groups of hackers, the self-identifieds and the ones that we had to attribute. On just the selfies alone, they had over 500 and some groups that we had identified. We do expect that, there may be some variations within the countries, more so because you see certain groups are more active than other groups. So we're actually going to be doing some deep dives next into the specific countries to say, okay, what are we seeing with these types of groups within the countries? So yes and no.
We have another question in the back?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Sample. It was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
I was curious, for when you're looking at a group of hackers that are coming out of Turkey, how do you account for individuals who may be Russian, but they're in Turkey using a Turkish server, in terms of the way you're looking at culture?
Okay, so that's a very good question. How are we able to distinguish, how are we pulling out the ones that are coming out of one country, but they're doing it, but they're actually from another country? That's where the attribution, using the 3 points attribution, takes place. So what we're looking at is first, what's the message that they're putting on the defaced site? If they, like, there was one that I have in my data set that said they were, I forget what country they said, it was one of the Middle East countries, and they said, but I live in Holland. Well, can't use them, at least not yet. So then they, so we go to the site first, then we go to the, so we check social media, see if we can get other clues about them from their social media presence, Facebook, Twitter accounts, things like that. Then after that, I also do some basic news scraping. If I still don't have I have enough to make me feel comfortable, because I need to have 3 sources. I have a friend that will not, I don't think I'm allowed to use his name, and he won't tell me who he works for, but he does open systems intelligence, and I throw it over to Scott and say, hey Scott, here you go, can you help me with this? And he gets back to me and says, yeah, I got this. Then I also have, this is why I only have 1,000 attributed. Then I also have my friends at work who will go ahead and do some things. Bill happens to speak Arabic, and so he'll go ahead and check out some other sites for me and say, okay, I found this on for you. So it's actually kind of a deep, as somebody said, it's a pretty high confidence attribution at this point. So that's probably why the numbers are so small.
Thank you.
I'll be happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Hey, I don't have any slides, so just you guys and me for much of time. So I'm Chris Spirito. I work for Idaho National Laboratory, Department of Energy Lab. Been there for about a year, and then before that I was at MITRE for a bunch of years. So the past 5 years I've spent more or less in the field working with international nuclear power plants and helping them understand the impacts from cyber attacks. And there's generally 2 engagement mechanisms that we have. The first one is through the International Atomic Energy Agency, and through the IAEA we have a set of consultancies that are run, and these consultancies are topically based. So the very first consultancy I started working on 5 years ago was on incident response to attacks on computer systems within nuclear power plants, and we generally try to avoid the use of the word cyber given its sort of ambiguity, and stuck with computer network attacks, computer system attacks. So other consultancies include ones that are based upon identifying incident analysis, being able to understand how different legal mechanisms are put in place. There's a bunch of different consultancies that the IEA runs. The other mechanism by which I engage is I go out in the field and I spend a lot of time doing training classes with foreign nuclear power plants. So upwards of about, I'm guessing this year, about 6 weeks abroad at different nuclear sites with the operators and the regulators. And I'll explain sort of how it looks when we get onto those sites. And essentially in the room, we usually have between 20 and 35 students, and those students are broken up. You'll have a whole bunch of nuclear operators, so the people that actually run the actual reactor systems within the nuclear power plants. You'll have another group there, which is the physical protection system group, and so they're the ones responsible for making sure no one can get near the nuclear power plant, and those that are allowed to come near the nuclear power plant are vetted every step of their way into the different areas allowed to get into. There's usually a group there from the regulatory agency in that country, and they're the ones responsible for leveraging down upon the nuclear power plant the requirements. So if you were to pick two groups in the room that don't get along the most often, it's the regulatory agency and the operators. And so we'll get into that a little bit because that's an important concept that I was driving towards. And then, we usually have some representatives from the national military that show up, usually one or two people, to represent their interest in protecting homeland security protection of nuclear power in that country. Hopefully we get one or two people from the national CERT, if a national CERT even exists in the country that we're visiting. And then generally past that, there's maybe one or two government people from maybe the energy agency that will show up to participate. So that's sort of what generally one of our classes looks like. And again, what we spend a lot of time doing is both helping them understand basic to intermediate cyber concepts of how cyber attacks and cyber campaigns look and feel within not only nuclear power plants but in general against large systems. But we do spend a lot of time doing role modeling with them. And so for the classes that we run through the IEA, we have an entire sort of fictional environment called Shaposh. And Shaposh is a nuclear power plant that we created. It has a whole bunch of, certain reactor design, a certain physical layout of the plant, the certain people that work there, policies and procedures. And so we spent a lot of time just working with the different groups in the room, helping them, through what to do in the case of an identified event that may have a cyber attack. And this is where a lot of what I wrote about in the paper is driven from. It's my observations of the interactions of the different groups in the room and trying to understand what are the things that they're struggling with most in order to help improve the cybersecurity of their environment. So as you can guess, the nuclear environment is predicated on a safety culture. If you've spent any time at a national laboratory or a nuclear environment, you've probably been given more than a few briefings on the importance of safety in that environment. And first and foremost, you're trying to make sure that you're constantly operating this environment in a safe mode, and there's one person that's assigned for each shift that the nuclear power plant is operating for determining if you're going to operate or you're going to shut down. So that's their job, safety first, everything else doesn't really matter. And they're the ones who have to make that decision. So our goals in terms of protecting the plant against cyber attacks were largely around reducing the threats associated to the theft of nuclear material as a first one. Second one is preventing the accidental release of radiation from any sort of core meltdown that might take place. And the third one is protecting those control systems, as we heard about before, from sabotage from outside parties. So the nice thing is that we're seeing sort of this movement from safety culture, trying to now take into consideration how do you integrate a security culture into a group of individuals who are sort of well vested in safety culture. So the nice thing is that rarely do I run into people at nuclear power plants who aren't already brilliant, right? So it's a really nice group of people to be working with because they're all super smart already. The tough part is they have almost no exposure to cyber attacks and attacks on computer networks and computer systems. There's usually one or two people that I can pretty much identify within the first about 8 minutes of the training who's going to be my best friend for the next 5 days that I'm in their country. Because they're the person who I'm going to be able to really talk with at a technical level about what's going on in their environment. And it's funny because a lot of what I end up doing is sort of taking what they tell me and then helping sort of relay it to the people in their management chain who can actually affect the change. Because it's funny how unempowered the operator is at nuclear power plants. Or I guess I should say the operator, but the one guy who understands how the security impacts take place and trying to sort of get their message known way up above. So when I started thinking about behaviors and cultures, I thought a little bit about the GGE NORMS working group, the group of governmental experts, and this is a group of nations that comes together. You got a nation through the first committee, and they came up with all of these sort of aspirational norms of nation-state behaviors, and you can argue whether they're useful or not. I'm not really sure, but one of their norms was, well, you shouldn't attack critical infrastructure, right? Now, in a sense, you're sort of like, well, I don't know. It's like kind of a weird norm, right? Because you're right. Like none of us should attack critical infrastructure because if you attack, an energy grid or you attack a nuclear power plant or you even attack, a financial system, there are real impacts to the community, to the nation that you're attacking, and it could cause loss of life. It could cause long-term outages. That could cause lots of inconvenience. So I can sort of agree on the idea that this is sort of a bad thing. But when you really think about this norm, you say, well, most militaries, most countries aren't going to necessarily abide by this norm because what the country is going to say is, well, we need to be able to assert dominance within your domain. And in order to do that, we need to be able to take out the particular CI component. So, that might not work so well. So I was sort of wondering, what do we do about this problem where we need to have protection of infrastructure? What kind of behaviors can we put into place? And one of the other issues that came up, and this is something I heard this morning, was the vagueness of definitions in our domain. And one of the things that I do at the beginning of sort of every week of classes, I talk through with the students definitions. Like, what do different terms mean to you? And the example I give, which I think always resonates with people, is a bunch of years ago, I was in Japan, and I'm sitting at the Japanese CERT, and my friend's there, and my good friend Masato-san. If you remember the first community, you'll know Masato-san because he's the guy who runs around, puts little Hello Kitty stickers on everyone's badges at the first conference to see if he can infect you, and then he puts up these big graphs of how many people he infected during the conference. Sort of a nifty little thing. But he and I were talking about this term, information sharing, and sharing is a very American term, very English American term. It's what you do in kindergarten, right? You send your kids off to kindergarten, you tell them to be a good kid and share with their friends, right? So I asked Masato-san, I go, well, what does sharing mean to you? And Masato said, well, that means that you give me information. I was like, it's sort of interesting, right? So when I say sharing to you, it has no implication that there's sort of reciprocity involved, like you're going to give me information back. And he's like, no. If you want that kind of relationship with me, you have to say information exchange. We have to set an information exchange agreement, and we have to call it that because that's how it's culturally recognized here in Japan. It's exchange, is not sharing isn't sort of a concept that we see in the same way. And I said, this is an important point, right? Because if we don't normalize our vocabulary ahead of time, then we run into these sort of bigger problems. So we spend a lot of time at the beginning of these classes talking about what does a computer network attack look like to you? What does a cyber attack look like to you? What do any of this terminology mean? And even very similar, the question of computer network exploitation and espionage and the crossover there, right? So if someone is scanning your systems, is that an attack? Is that just C&E? I mean, what if an adversary makes their way into your system, right? Say a foreign intelligence service makes their way into your system. They're like, well, I'm kind of feeling happy today. I'm going to patch your system before you get out and leave you a note saying I was here. Well, is that an attack, or is that that espionage with a good slant to it? I mean, who really knows? But the point is, there is sort of this vagueness that we run into. Spend a little bit of time just talking about that with the students. So I really thought about what do I want to really convey to these students? What I'll take with them from place to place is the first thing is I want to be able to expand their knowledge of threat and understand the attack vectors, what they look like. I want to help them understand and how to establish operational cyber competencies in their environment. And finally, I want to help them understand a little bit about how to shift from reactive measures to proactive measures in their environment. This is probably one of the tougher things to do with them. So the 3 norms that I'm proposing, that I proposed in my paper was, the first one is as simple as awesome as it sounds, is consider the possibilities. All right, and we'll talk about that in a sec. The second one is that practice makes perfect, and the third norm is implement some active cyber defense into your world. So the first norm, to consider the possibilities, this is sort of a huge problem, and we even heard a little bit about it today. And I don't mean to sound like in a negative way, but like the fact that we talk about cyber attacks as a thing that happens in a moment of time is like terrible, because cyber attacks don't happen in a moment of time. They happen across like days and months and years, and they're part of these long campaigns that, you know, and when you have people thinking that I need to find a moment of time and react to it, they're completely not going to be able to adapt to the larger problem set that they're trying to address. And so a lot of what we're trying to tell them is, you know, don't just think of things that you're looking at as attacks. Think of them as indicators that, when pieced together with other things that you might observe, even from different domains, not just in the cyber domain, but from other domains as well, that when you look at them as a whole, they may constitute an attack on your facility or your core function or whatever it might be. So that's sort of the first thing I talk to them about, is how to understand the cyber attack life cycle, you know, for really a mechanism by which you can say, these are like, you know, 7 different areas by which I can identify indicators of someone who's trying to do something to me that I should be aware of, and at some point make an informed decision of how I should respond to this particular thing that's there. So that's sort of the first part, that's sort of the possibilities. The second part really has more to do with a nuclear security practice, which is problematic. And so nuclear power plants are built based upon something called a design basis threat. And essentially what that is that if the nuclear power plant gets together with all of their experts on usually physical security, now more so ICT security, cyber security, and they decide what threats does this plant face. So if you are a nuclear power plant and you sit on the eastern side of Ukraine, you might say, well, you know, I have some geographic neighbors who aren't as friendly to me as I would like, so that's going to be something that I apply into my design basis threat. I have these actors who have these capabilities with these control systems, so I have to put more sensing and sensors on these systems. So I can design out this sort of threat model, and then I put into place the technical countermeasures to adapt to those. Now the problem is that you can't just go into a nuclear environment and patch systems. Now, this is one of the big constraints in nuclear environments, is that you can't do a lot of the things in a nuclear power plant that you can do in traditional business networks, or even maybe traditional energy grid systems that you see. So what we really have to sort of work with them on is this: well, what do you do in those cases? And the one thing that they tend to do when they have a system sort of get fail, if you will, they restore it to the design basis threat, which is essentially saying they restore it to the point at which it's accredited. And the one thing they don't do is a lot of forensics on that system. They don't really ever consider the possibility that that system failed because of some sort of cyber origin event. And this is a big problem that we try to say to them, you know, look at this, try to figure out, you know, before you restore that system, do you have a way to image this particular system? And if it's a control system, then it's a matter of working with vendors now and trying to have them provide access to us of mechanisms of imaging memory segments of those control systems, which is very easy to do on computers, but not so easy to do on control systems. So that's sort of the first norm, is consider the possibilities. The second norm has to do with practice makes perfect, and this has a good origin in the classes that we provide. So the classes, again, these groups in the classes, the regulatory agency, the operators, the CERT, a lot of times when they come into my classroom, that's the first time they've ever met. And it's crazy to think that in any of these countries that you'd have a CERT that's never talked to the power plant. A CERT, you know, the regulatory agency never talked to the CERT. And so throughout these scenarios we create for them communication opportunities. So we say, okay, here's the situation, and you know, we feed indicators to each group independently, and now we observe the interaction between the operator, who has to receive advice from the regulator about an event that we created through the simulation. So this is something that's just creating these communication pathways, and more importantly, normalizing them so they become part of a day-to-day practice, if you will, in that country. And it's amazing just that how many people are just afraid to have the conversation for fear of exposing their own sort of lack of knowledge in the domain, or fear that the regulator, if you tell them that you have these problems, are just going to really come down on you and tell you to stop operating. And this classroom gives them the opportunity to sort of start working their way into these conversations in a safe environment without sort of compromising the operational processes in place. And maybe the third part, which is probably the most interesting and most controversial, is I teach a class on denial and deception. And so one of the things I've been trying to advocate to nuclear power plants is stop trying to just do sort of prescriptive things where you have a checklist that the regulatory agency provides you and you just go do that to your systems. Start putting into place some mechanisms by which you can identify more actions left of hack, if you will. So a very simple, awesome, easy example would be in the case of a hospital that handles nuclear material. So if you're a hospital that handles any sort of nuclear material for your nuclear medicine clinic, there's always a health physicist that works for your hospital. The health physicist, their role in life is to make sure that that material is accounted for and properly protected and so forth. So a nice simple thing you could do if you are in the denial and deception domain is spend a few months to create a false persona, build it up on LinkedIn and build it up on different social networks and build up their background for where they attend university for this health physicist, and then place that health physicist on your public website. And so give it a debt email account. That's a really nice, simple way to figure out if someone's interested in your health physicist or your nuclear materials, right? Now, could those, is every email going to give an indication of that? Maybe not. But the point is, if you don't have those types of simple sort of things in place, you're not going to be able to pick up on a lot of the things that happen, sort of left of hack. So that's a good example. And I think that's my time is out. I have like a minute for questions, and that was fun. All right. So, is there any questions?
Yeah. Question in front?
To this last point about denial and deception, in the regulatory environments that you're working in or that you're observing, do those have the wiggle room or the resources to even think about doing something like that? I mean, even in the States, under a regime like FSMA, it's kind of hard to do anything innovative and do something that far left. Do you see? Is there uptake in your environment?
Yeah, yes, there is. I guess I should preface the answer with, so, again, like I mentioned, prior to joining the lab last January, I was with MITRE, for a bunch of years, and so even though I was doing a lot of nuclear work at the end of my career there, a lot of my work was like military intelligence work for the rest of my career there, which was a lot of denial and deception work. So I will argue that no one else is talking about it but me to these countries. And I have, sort of nice exposure with them in person to talk to them about these things. So, like, I would say there's an Asian country who has been like wholly receptive that we did a whole class with on this topic, and they were like, cool, this is something that we can do. But I also say that their intel military side is like way far advanced compared to like, Slovenia, where I was in September, who are like, you gotta be kidding me, right? We don't have the resources to do this, right? But the point is, exposing them to these concepts is important. And I always I even tell the students during the class, I say, don't try to do everything at once. Just pick like one thing and see if you can accomplish like one thing, do it well, understand it, and then just move on from there and do another thing. Because if you sort of set your ambition like so darn high, you'll never get there. Yeah. All right, cool, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for the introduction. Again, Mike did a great introduction for me. I've been talking a whole lot about disruptive innovation, but innovations in general. And the co-author with me on this article was Dr. Nick Zambog, who's currently teaching at Maxwell Air Force Base. So if I can't make fun of my own organization, who can I make fun of? So we have, in addition to CyCon US here at the Army Cyber Institute, we also host two conferences, a conference twice a year called Cyber Talks, modeled after TED Talks. And the tagline we use for that is disruptive cyber innovation. So when I saw that, I said, well, what is disruptive cyber innovation? I have an idea of what it is. And this was the one that was, we had a PR write-up on it, and it says, this conference gives voice to disruptive cyber innovation. So the question I asked is, what is disruptive cyber innovation? And so the great thing about following these 3 talks is it's important to make distinctions. And what I do with innovation is I don't think of innovation as just one type of innovation. As we heard from Senator Warner and even from General Alexander, we want to be the best in innovation here in America. And when I look at innovation, I try to make distinctions. The first criteria I use to distinguish innovations is the complexity or level of sophistication. The second criteria is the targeted marketing, whether it's a new market that's underrepresented or an existing market. And when I do that, what I get are 4 distinct quadrants. On the low technological sophistication and existing markets, we call that sustaining innovations. On the high tech, but still existing markets, I call that incremental or evolutionary types of innovation. On the high tech and then new markets, we call that breakthrough. And finally, what I call a disruptive is new markets with low tech. And I think we've heard some examples in this Chris's speech. So that's great. You're helping me out with my next paper. Just to highlight again why distinctions are important, the secondary title of my paper, if you haven't read it yet, my paper was going to be called Is the Tomato a Fruit? Any botanists in the audience? Any aspiring botanists after having watched The Martian? Okay, well, I was inspired by The Martian, and right, is the tomato a fruit? A show of hands. Tomato is a fruit. I guess everyone else thinks tomato is a vegetable then, right? Okay. We'll see. Well, we have, if we break up the plant into its subcomponents, right, we have roots, which consist of carrots, potatoes, yams, and I had someone in the audience, or actually one of my friends challenged me, I'm going to include beets and roots in there, beets and radishes, that's what she wanted me to add in there. Stems, right, asparagus, sugarcane, celery, leaves, right, we had some of that this afternoon in the lunch. And then fruit, and that's where our tomato is. I love the little tomatoes. It is a fruit if you're a botanist. So that's a nice thing. So again, distinctions help us to categorize and bound what's in and out. As we've heard from the 3 panel speakers today, it's sort of important to do that. It helps us to do that. And so if we turn back to innovations, the way I describe sustaining innovations, it makes more sense to you, is use Spock, right? He's a logical expert. He's going everything by probabilities, and that's sustaining innovation, right? Whatever is trying to get us towards efficiency gains. That's what sustaining innovations are, or tend to be. If we go towards incremental, right, spy versus spy, the evolutionary, you're trying to one-up your opponent. Okay. Breakthrough, I call that the James Bondian type of innovations, right? We have Q there that has the unlimited wealth of MI6 and apparently, Brexit didn't really matter to England at the time. So we have some breakthrough technologies, very expensive. And disruptive, again, what I'm focusing this talk is, right, any MacGyver fans? Right, he's making use of what's available. And again, if I think the audience, if I poll the audience, I think we're old enough to know MacGyver. If you're not too familiar with MacGyver, I've got Matt Damon and Jason Bourne. So Jason Bourne, right, he's driving the original Mini Coupe and making what's available, making do what's available. Now, if you look at this slide, right, what's the odd thing that's off? Now, I am a military intelligence guy, so I want to make my slides consistent. Yeah, Spock is not an MI guy, right? So if you don't like Spock there, if you remember Leonard Nimoy, he starred in Mission Impossible as Paris. And again, he was the master of disguise, which makes him a great sustaining type of innovator, right? So that's how I describe disruptive innovation, or really all 4 types of innovation. Okay. But again, we have a mathematician or data scientist, so she should be very questioning these slides I have here. Right? There are no numbers on my axes, which is terrible. Right? This is like almost a business school type of a presentation. Okay. But if we go back to if you read my paper, I talk about really the officer strategy. And the whole idea with we're currently going in on the 3rd officer strategy. We heard a little bit about that in some of the keynote speeches. But from a military perspective, sustaining innovations are what I consider like the M16. right? Back in the 1960s, 70s, the M216 was invented. When we had model A1, A2, A3. Now we have the M4. So those are sustaining types of innovations. When we look towards incremental, right? My example is chaff. Chaff was initially designed to target against or combat against a countermeasure against radar. Then it was used against incoming missiles. So it's a supply type scenario. Breakthrough, right? Our first offset strategy, breakthrough technologies, nuclear weapons. Very expensive, very heavy intensive R&D, time intensive, right? A lot of resources. The second breakthrough or second offset strategy, mostly led by DARPA after the Vietnam War. That included things like we talked about this morning, where we had stealth, we had GPS. Someone mentioned radar, right? We're mentioning we're tied in GPS today. And we also have precision guided munitions. So again, high tech, high expense, high R&D costs. Okay. So what about disruptive, right? Do we have actually disruptive things in our history? Can we do disruptive? I'm trying to focus our country now on possibly doing disruptive innovations. Well, let's think all the way back now, right? Before we were born, I think everyone in the audience, the Revolutionary War. We have a history of disruptive innovations, right? When we fought the British regulars, our irregulars were disruptive. Asymmetric, someone mentioned that earlier this morning. Asymmetric warfare is disruptive warfare. Okay. We have, in this case, that is a picture of a submarine getting essentially blown up. Again, my background is I am a systems engineer, and the history that I studied for disruptive innovations was World War II. Do you remember, I guess Turing was very popular. I guess if you watched, what was that movie that just came out? Imitation Game, right? Yeah, perfect. But also, from the US side, we did a lot of operations research. And a disruptive innovation that took place during World War II was the creation of operations research statistical techniques to analyze when ships survived and when they didn't. And it turns out when they did statistical analysis, when you were a convoy of 2 or more ships, your likelihood of surviving shot up. When they captured these U-boat commanders after the war was over, or during the war, they found out U-boat commanders were very, very fearful of getting sunk, right? You've watched those movies, U-571, all those other movies, right? Being a submarine is not cool when someone has spotted you. And so again, operations research, statistical techniques to combat against this threat, in this case, U-boats. Someone else talked about UAVs. UAVs today are probably a disruptive influence, right? Cheaper, relatively speaking. Perhaps faster, I'm not sure. Faster to the market, we'll see. Okay. But those are types of disruptive influences that we've had in our military, and we do have a history of it. So again, just going back to, again, I still don't have any numbers in my axes. So this should be very concerning to a lot of our mathematicians out there. Okay, so I'm going to actually add another axis here, probability of success. When we talk about offset strategies, or actually probability of success, I'm just going to focus on probability of success. When we think about probability of success, right, this is probably the way it should look. Right? Our sustaining and our incremental innovations should have high probability of success in the 70 to 90% range. Okay, so if you're talking about innovation, I generally don't think you're talking about sustaining or incremental innovations. We're really talking about disruptive and breakthrough. However, the probability of success for those anecdotally is anywhere from 10 to 30%, at best 30%. So this is really what it would look like. That's why it's great not having numbers sometimes. I can modify my slides. Okay, so that's if I put that axis. If I change it now, again, probability of success to offset potential. That's the opposite, right? The opposite now is the offset potential is greater when I am looking at breakthrough, disruptive and breakthrough technologies or innovations. Opposite now for the bottom quadrants, right? Sustaining incremental, very low. And again, this is probably what it would look like if I add that third axis. And this is a different way of looking at what I have. Okay, this is actually comes from most of what I have here. The literature review is Joseph Bauer and Thane Christensen, who talk a lot about disruptive innovations, and they come up with this essentially timeline matched against performance. And sustaining incremental improvements, like I told you, low offset potential, and so really they're actually meeting market expectations over time. You see that graph? We have a nice increasing slope. Hopefully it's an increasing slope, not decreasing over time. or flat, right? And so it's increasing over time. But what we see is breakthroughs, right? It's jumping the curve. That's why I call breakthroughs jumping the curve type of innovation. Expensive to do though. That's the difficult part of breakthrough innovations. However, what Christensen and Bauer studied though is in our really probably the past 30, 40 years, right? The industrial age gave us really that sustaining incremental innovations. That's the industrial forces. It's tough to beat the leading industries. But Christensen and Bauer, they studied this whole notion of why is it that we have leading companies that fail to stay at the top of their industries when technologies and markets change. And what they focus in on are disruptive innovations. These innovations tend to be cheaper. Again, I told you it's less technology sophisticated, and they're targeting new markets. And the same thing with breakthrough targeting new markets. The thing with disruptive innovations, though, they initially appeal only to small emerging markets, small subset group. Initially far worse on at least one performance criteria than the market leaders. But the nice thing is that new value criteria improves at a rapid rate. So let me give you some examples of that. Okay, we have Xerox versus Canon. Do you ever remember Xerox PARC? In here? That was the leading innovator, right? Back in the 70s and 80s, that was where you wanted to work if you were a research scientist. They got disrupted by Canon, right? Xerox was focusing on those huge printers. They did everything for you. They collated, they printed both sides, they printed color. They were stapling for it, they were punching holes. Wherever you wanted, it was customizable. Canon comes along, they give us the home-based printer, right? And so HP follows later on, and HP actually then comes up with the inkjet printer, which would become disruptive and cannibalize their own markets, but that's another notion of disruptive innovations. We also have IBM versus Apple. What was IBM famous for? Or at least the long time in the 70s and 80s. Mainframes, right? They thought mainframe computers would rule the world. Okay? And then all of a sudden this little upstart comes up, Steve Jobs, right? You've seen many movies, right? He's thinking about, personal computers. Right? Apple laughed, or IBM laughs at him, no, that's never gonna take off. Guess what, it does take off, right? And that's what we're using, so a lot of folks have laptops here, tablets as well, smartphones. Here's the big one, right? You have the big three automakers. What was the shock that put the Japanese companies up really high for us? Quality was actually improving. There was an oil shock right in the late 70s. That's when the new value criteria was fuel efficiency. Right? Before GM, Ford, and Chrysler, they were building the big behemoths that sucked up gas, but they gave good acceleration. They gave great comfort. They gave great space. And then these little Japanese imports, right? The Toyotas, the Hondas, they were very small, very low in power, but very energy efficient. And so when the oil crisis hit us, right, the oil shocks, it was a huge shift towards the Japanese market. Okay, so now let's look at how we can actually best protect the future, now that we understand that we can break innovations into segments and different distinctions. And that's really what I think Senator Warner was really talking about. Okay. The good news is he did make a great prediction, right? He said that there's more thinkers of innovation taking place in Northern Virginia. If we consider this room, I think I've just hopefully increased everyone's thought on innovation, so hopefully that's the case. You can let me know if that's not the case, and I'll try to make my presentation a little better. But again, we have the best way, it's not really just doing disruptive innovations. My argument is that you need to be doing all. Disruptive, breakthrough, as well as sustaining incremental. The problem is that we're not doing enough disruptive, right? Our government, we are great at breakthrough innovations. Who remembers the speech from the Mr. Wozniak earlier with Raytheon and Carlos Vegas, and that was like the best slides you'd ever seen in a long time. Those are breakthrough innovations, right? A lot of that stuff Raytheon's doing, breakthrough. Our government's great at that. We do great at breakthrough innovations. Okay? So where's the disruptive innovation? That's the argument I'm trying to make. And whoops, I think I pushed it on screen. There we go. Here's the problem in not thinking about disruptive innovations. Okay? We have a couple of conflicts going on, or at least Korean War. In the Korean War, General MacArthur consistently underestimated the Chinese military strength by a factor of 10. Do we know why? He relied on aerial photography. Someone mentioned that in the keynote speech, right? We have great airplanes and they're doing reconnaissance. The Chinese conduct their movements exclusively at night. That's a disruptive innovation, right? It's not a widget. In this case, it's a tactic they employ. What about the Vietnam War? We bombed the heck out of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Right? Our Air Force, we had air dominance in the Vietnam War. And we bombed the heck out of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and yet the Ho Chi Minh Trail continued. It caused problems for our military. It's because the Ho Chi Minh Trail initially did not rely on infrastructure, right? Not a road network or a rail network. And so once it was bombed, right, the North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, they were able to bypass all the destruction. Eventually, they did create road networks and rail networks that did support their efforts. But that was after our bombing campaigns. What about Iraq and Afghanistan? Recent wars. What was the main killer out there? Was it, some high-tech laser or IEDs, right? Wherever it was available. They were doing MacGyver. They out-MacGyvered us in these recent wars. Now, if we think about cyber, where would you put most offensive cyber tools? They're disruptive. They're existing. They are not very high-tech. They are looking for the holes, right? You don't have to be high-tech. They don't have to use a lot of expense. They don't have to use a lot of time, right? And so if we ignore the disruptive space, we do that at our peril, okay? But if we do consciously ignore it, I say we war game against disruptive technologies or disruptive innovations that can offset our breakthrough strategies. And with that, I'll open up to questions.
I like your slides, but I don't think Clay Christensen rules anymore. So let's go 0 to 1 with this question and say distributed ledger technology like blockchain, where's that in your book? Is it disruptive? Is it breakthrough? Is it just really sustaining technology?
I am not too familiar with that, but the great thing about, again, these categories is that it's not up to me. Perceptions are where you perceive it to be. Where actually do you perceive it to be? Sustaining. I would probably agree, but the reality is, right, it depends on your frame of mind. And it really doesn't matter whatever innovation we're actually trying to invent or produce or create. It's the going in thought. What are we going after? Are we going after sustaining incremental innovations to combat a threat? Or are we going for those offset strategies? If we're truly pursuing an offset strategy, we should be going for a disruptive or breakthrough type of innovation. And that's why I actually asked if there's anyone in the audience that was, you cut off my extra slides. I was going to have an extra slide here. Remember, I started off my presentation with the second. Oh, okay. Yeah, I started off with this tomato fruit. It depends on your perspective. Look at the bottom here. We have a lawyer, I know that. We have at least one lawyer in the room. I think I'm going to pull that. I'm almost out of time, but this one goes to it, right? According to this 1893 law, a tomato is a vegetable, and it's for taxation and tariff purposes. They didn't want to tax it from a vegetable perspective.
Hi, Steve Kandari from I Know This Incorporated. My question actually is separate. I was just going to say, I'm not sure, is blockchain a new technology, or is that just a new use of existing technology? I'll throw that out. My question is, earlier you were mentioning about disruptive technologies, that they start off in niche areas, and I was sort of curious why you think that's the case. Why is it that these new techniques or new technologies start out in small areas and aren't accepted early on?
Yeah, Christensen and Bauer talk about that exclusively. Extensively. The problem is, right, on the green line, the sustaining and incremental innovations, those are the market leaders. They dominate the industry. So the problem is, how can you ever compete against a GM, a Ford, a Chrysler, an IBM, a Xerox? Well, you can't compete with them one-on-one on the same attributes. You have to create something that gives value added to a new customer base that rapidly improves. Now, I do want to highlight, again, most disruptive, even most breakthrough innovations fail.
Why?
It's because, again, it's the performance attributes for most of these. So I've given you the examples of the success, right? There's hundreds of Yugos out there.
I think your examples are great, but a lot of them are sort of dated. And I'm sort of thinking today, 2015, 2016, 2017 timeframe. Everybody has access to this stuff. Back in those days, people didn't have knowledge, didn't have communication. It took time for news to get around. That's not the case today. And I see a lot of the same kind of characteristics today. And I'm sort of curious, my question is why?
Yeah, the why is tough, but I'll give you another example, a more recent one. Who still has the BlackBerries? Who's using iPhones? Well, more. I counted 2 more hands than BlackBerries. So, BlackBerries, again, almost the same features. BlackBerry's more complex, right? Apple, they simplified it. Make it simple, make it less complex. People go for simple over complex. The masses will over time. And that's a great example of recently how we can use simplicity as a way to combat, even though the iPhone, some will argue that's technology complex, but in the relative scale, it really is not that complex. And I have a paper that I wrote about that, why the smartphone is really not it's a disruptive innovation.
All right, thank you to our panelists this afternoon. I thought that was a very energetic and very diverse panel for looking at our cyber norms and the way we need to approach things and look at things in the future. Again, a nice round of applause for our panelists.